Watch closely. You are looking at the last one. Every animal of its kind that came before is already gone. And in 3 years, this one, pacing a concrete pen on the far side of the world, will be gone too. When it opens its mouth, it gapes wider than the jaws of any dog alive. They called it a tiger for its stripes, and a wolf for its face. But almost everything we believed about this animal was wrong, including the reason we killed it. Its closest living relative is small enough to sit in the palm of your hand. And a century after we watched it die, a laboratory is trying to bring it back. 200 years ago, the ships came south, and they brought sheep. The settlers carved farms out of the Tasmanian bush, on land that had belonged for longer than memory to a predator. Perhaps 5,000 of them still move through the island's forests, wary and secretive. To the newcomers, they were a problem waiting for a solution. The stories started almost at once. A farmer would find a dead ewe at dawn, its throat torn open, and everyone knew what to blame. In the retelling, the animal grew. It killed for sport, drank the blood of the flock, and left the meat. Became a monster, cunning and insatiable and everywhere at once. So they put a price on its head. A private company offered the first rewards. Then the government made it official. £1 for every grown animal, 10 shillings for every pup. A shy forest hunter had become a kind of currency. The men came with guns, snares, dogs, and poison. This was not a hunt, it was a clearance. Year after year, the carcasses were carried in for payment on more than 2,000 of them, and those were only the ones that were written down. By the time anyone asked whether the stories had ever been true, there was almost nothing left to save. For all the fear, almost no one asked the simplest question. Not whether it was guilty, we'll come to that, but what it actually was. Because it wore the body of a dog. The long muzzle, the lean, deep-chested frame built for the chase, nearly 2 meters from nose to the tip of a stiff, heavy tail. Everything about it said predator, and everything about it said dog. And then you would see the pouch. It was a marsupial. It carried its young the way a kangaroo does, sealed blind and half-formed into a fold of skin. Its nearest living relatives aren't wolves or foxes or dogs of any kind. They are the Tasmanian devil, the quolls, and at the far end of the family, a carnivorous marsupial that weighs around 15 grams. And in this animal, it wasn't only the females that carried a pouch. The males did too. This is convergent evolution. Hand the same problem, how to be a fast, sharp-toothed hunter, to 2 lineages that split in the deep past, and every so often they build the same animal on their own. The dog's body was engineered twice, once in the north, in the ancestors of the wolf, and once here, at the bottom of the world, in a creature that never shared a step of that road. And the resemblance runs deep. Measure the skull by its shape alone, and this marsupial falls closer to a red fox and a gray wolf than to the devils and quolls it is actually related to. Its own family would not recognize its face. So evolution built the wolf a second time, which leaves the one question that should stop you cold. How? Start with time. The wolf and this animal did share an ancestor, but you have to go back 160 million years to find it, when dinosaurs still ruled, and that common grandparent was a small shrew-like thing in their shadow. From it, 2 lineages split. One became the placental mammals, ending in the wolf, the other, the marsupials. For 160 million years, they never touched again. Separate continents, complete isolation. And at the end of that road, both of them on their own built the same predator. Here is what you would assume, that if 2 animals end up identical, evolution solved the problem the same way. The same switches, the same genes. It didn't. When the Thylacine's genome was read beside the wolf's, The obvious answer: collapsed. The gene selection that actually shaped in each were different, markedly different, and the few places their proteins matched looked less like a shared solution than coincidence. So how do you build the same animal twice without the same genes? You change how the genes are read. Every mammal carries much the same toolkit. What differs is the instructions, the switches deciding when and where each gene fires as the embryo forms. The two converge not by rewriting their genes, but by rewriting those instructions, most of all in the parts that shape the face and jaw. The same bricks, a different blueprint, the same house. But a shape can be copied. What runs beneath it cannot. Underneath that borrowed body, in the one place it mattered most, the machine worked differently from a wolf's, which is where the story of the sheep killer comes apart. We built the wolf's double a second time, but no one ever checked whether the copy worked like the original. Recently, someone did. Engineers rebuilt the Thylacine skull inside a computer and stress tested it, simulating the bite and the pull of struggling prey. Then ran the same tests on its closest relatives, the devil and the quoll, whose diets we know. The result was not close. Of the three, the Thylacine skull was the weakest, the least able to withstand the force of its own jaw. That astonishing gape from the opening frames, the wide mouth that looked built to kill, concealed a bite that was, for a predator of perhaps 30 kilograms, remarkably feeble. So what could it actually catch? Small, agile things. Possums, bandicoots, young wallabies. Now hold that against the crime. The animal was killed by the thousands for slaughtering sheep, and its jaw was too weak to take one. The reputation that sentenced an entire species to death was, in the words of the researchers, at best, overblown. So what was really killing the flocks? Feral dogs, the settlers' own animals, gone wild, and the ordinary killers of livestock everywhere. Poor land, poor weather, poor management. Sheep died for 100 reasons, and the shy hunter in the hills was blamed for nearly all of them. Rarely seen, easily hated, unable to argue. Even the darkest story traces back to almost nothing. A single second-hand account hardened by retelling into fact. By the end, at least 3,500 had been killed. The full price of a species erased for something it could not physically do. And the cruelest part? The sheep were never the real threat to its survival. Long before the first settler raised a rifle, the Thylacine was already walking a knife edge, for reasons buried in its own body and its own deep past. The knife edge had two edges. The first was written in its genes. Read the Thylacine's genome and you can wind its history backwards like a clock. What you find is a species in slow decline. Not for centuries, but for tens of thousands of years, long before any humans set foot in Australia. Between 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, during a global cold snap, its numbers crashed and its diversity fell with them and never recovered, leaving less room to adapt when the world changed. And its body offered no more comfort. A predator that can take only small prey is a specialist, magnificent and fragile, with nowhere to turn when the good times end. Now look at the map. For most of its existence, the Thylacine did not belong to Tasmania at all. It ranged across the whole Australian mainland and into New Guinea, the predator of a continent. And then, a few thousand years ago, it vanished from all of it. Every last mile, except one island. Something had arrived. The dingo. A true dog, the very thing the Thylacine only resembled. It hunted in packs. The Thylacine hunted alone. Two predators, one prey, and the lone hunter lost. Wherever the dingo spread, the Thylacine vanished behind it, except where the dingo could not reach. At the end of the last ice age, rising seas drowned the land bridge south, and Tasmania became an island. sealed off thousands of years before the first dingo landed. That drowned coastline was the Thylacine salvation. It survived precisely because the water kept its rival out. So the animal the settlers found was no thriving monster. It was the last remnant of a fragile, specialized, threadbare predator saved once by luck. It would not be lucky twice. When the end came, it came in a cage. About 80 seconds of black and white film and a handful of other clips, barely 3 minutes in all, is very nearly everything we have of a living thylacine. A predator that once ruled a continent, reduced to 3 minutes of flickering, silent footage, almost the entire visual memory of a species. We even gave the animal in that footage a name, Benjamin. But that name was invented 3 decades after it died, in the 1960s, by a man who claimed to have worked at the zoo, and never had. It spread anyway, and it has never stopped. The truth is quieter and sadder. The last of its kind most likely died without a name at all. And here's the part that should unsettle you most. We are not even certain the animal on that film was the last one. The individual everyone pictures may have died months before the true final thylacine, an old creature that slipped away off camera, unphotographed, barely noticed. What we do know is exact and merciless. After a century of trying to wipe it from the earth, the government finally granted the thylacine legal protection on the 10th of July, 1936. 59 days later, the last one was dead. It was the only thylacine ever to live and die a protected species. How it died, we still argue. Neglect, locked out of its shelter on a freak night of heat and cold, or simply old age. But the ending is not in doubt. On the 7th of September 1936, in a small enclosure in Hobart, the last thylacine on Earth died. Alone. And then it was nearly lost a second time. Its body was skinned, its skeleton laid out on a set of cards. And for years the remains of the last thylacine were carried into schoolrooms and passed from hand to hand, patted by children who were never told they were touching the last of an entire species. They sat unrecognized in a museum drawer until a few years ago, when someone finally went looking and found them. And still the world could not say the word. For half a century the thylacine stayed on the list of the living. Until in 1986, 50 years after that solitary death, it was finally declared extinct. 50 years to accept what a single empty cage had already made true. But a date on a document has never been enough to kill a legend, because by then, out in the Tasmanian bush, people had already begun to see it again. Officially, it was over. The forests of Tasmania never got the message. In the decades since the last one died, more than 1,000 people have reported seeing a thylacine. One study gathered 1,237 accounts from 1910 to 2019. And not only from Tasmania, but from the mainland, where it had supposedly vanished thousands of years before. Footprints on a riverbank, a striped body on a beach, seen, it was said, by dozens at once. And these were not all nervous tourists mistaking a dog for a legend. The most famous sighting came from a park ranger in 1982, who watched a thylacine for several minutes, fully lit in his spotlight. It was judged so credible that the government launched a search that ran for more than 2 years and found nothing. Then comes the part that should trouble anyone certain of the ending. Scientists scored the whole century of sightings for reliability and fed them into a model, and concluded not that the witnesses were deceived, but the opposite, that a small population likely clung on in the remote Northwest for decades after that last animal died, perhaps as late as the 1980s. The ending, we all learned, may have come too early. But surviving then is not surviving now. In nearly 90 years, with rewards past $1 million, with camera traps through the wilderness, with thousands of watching eyes, no one has produced a body. No bone, no skull, no confirmed photograph of a single living thylacine. The most unforgiving analysis puts the odds it still walks the earth at around 1 in a trillion. So why do the sightings never stop? Perhaps because we need them not to. The thylacine has become the animal we most wish we had not destroyed, and every striped shape at the edge of the headlight offers a chance, however thin, to be told that we didn't. To find one alive would be a kind of absolution. It is a great deal to ask of a shadow between the trees. For 90 years we searched the forest for a ghost, and the forest gave us nothing back. And so we have stopped waiting for the thylacine to return on its own. Instead, we have decided to build one. In a laboratory, not in Tasmania, but in Texas and Melbourne. That is exactly what they are trying to do. It begins with the dead, from preserved specimens more than a century old, a skull, a scrap of tissue in a jar. Scientists have reconstructed more than 99.9% of the thylacine's genetic code, the most complete genome ever assembled for any extinct animal. The full blueprint of the creature we erased, pulled from its own remains. But a blueprint is not an animal. To build one, you need a living cell to write it into, and for that, they turn to the closest surviving relative. The 15-gram marsupial we met earlier, the fat-tailed dunnart, a tiny ferocious carnivore into whose cells they are now editing the thylacine, one instruction at a time. Already more than 300 changes to a single cell, the most heavily edited animal cell ever made. And here the story folds back on itself. The very switches that sculpted the thylacine's impossible face had been found, and are being written into that dunnart cell, teaching the tissue of a tiny marsupial to build the skull of a vanished predator. The machinery is falling into place. They have grown marsupial embryos more than halfway to term inside an artificial womb, and they have shown the method works. In 2025, the same company revealed living pups carrying the form of the dire wolf, gone more than 10,000 years. By their own estimate, a thylacine could walk in Tasmania again within a decade. And yet, step back, and a strange, familiar shape appears in it. What they are building is a dunnart, reshaped gene by gene into the likeness of something it is not, the very thing this whole story has circled from the start, a body wearing the form of another, a resemblance engineered. So the oldest question it ever posed returns one last time. Would the thing they make truly be a thylacine, or the most convincing echo of one ever built? It would carry the code, but not the life that came with it. The knowledge lost with the last of them. The unbroken line reaching back to the age of the dinosaurs. The final death, alone, in that cage. And people are divided on whether we should even try. A debt we owe the animal we destroyed, or a comfort that makes losing the next one easier to bear. 100 years ago, we had the power to end this animal, and we used it. Soon we may have the power to call something like it back. What we do with that power, and what we would truly be holding, is a question we can no longer avoid. Because the answer is almost here.